Hello, and once again, I appreciate your listening in as we turn to the Psalms. For this particular devotional, I'm looking at Psalm 143. This psalm, like so many of them do, provides us with another lesson on prayer. David is the author, and once again, we find him in a difficult trial. And so he cries out to God. God answers, and he, in turn, praises God. We can't identify for sure the situation behind this psalm, but there is a reference in verse 3 to dwelling in dark places, like those who have been long dead. It sounds much like the situation in Psalm 142, where David was hiding from Saul in the cave. But whatever the exact situation, the language is certainly general enough that we can identify with David. He was in a severe trial where he desperately needed God to answer. And so he cries out to God, looking for his help in a very difficult situation. So I want to begin by considering, first of all, the trouble David experienced. That'll take us through the first 4 verses. So let me read Psalm 143, verses 1 through 4. Hear my prayer, O Lord, give ear to my supplications. In thy faithfulness answer me, and in thy righteousness. And enter not into judgment with thy servant, for in thy sight shall no man living be justified. For the enemy hath persecuted my soul. He hath smitten my life down to the ground. He hath made me to dwell in darkness, as those that have been long dead. Therefore is my spirit overwhelmed within me, my heart within me is desolate. We see here David's appeal to God in his time of trouble. He first of all appeals for God to answer him, as we note in verse 1. And in so doing, he appeals to God's faithfulness and God's righteousness. As David knew God, he understood that God was too faithful to forget his covenant that he had made with him. And God was too righteous to allow David's enemies to be victorious over him. When we know God, as David knew God, when we have that intimate relationship with God, our prayers take on that certain confidence that God will act according to his nature. And so David prays, asking God to respond to his cries as a God who is faithful and a God who is righteous. And then David appeals for God to withhold judgment from him. We see that in verse 2. Here we see David's humility. He is painfully aware of his own sin and what it is that he truly deserves from God. And so he is asking that God would respond to him out of his grace and mercy. He says in verse 8, cause me to hear thy loving kindness in the morning. Again, David's appeal to God is all based upon the nature of God, his faithfulness, his righteousness, his grace, and his mercy. Then we see David's experience in his time of trouble here in verses 3 and 4. We notice that David experienced persecution from his enemies. That's made clear in verse 3. As I mentioned, David may be describing his cave experience, or perhaps he may just be using vivid imagery. But in describing his experience as one who is long dead would certainly imply that he felt abandoned and forgotten. So whatever the specific event, he was being severely persecuted by an enemy, and he was in certainly a desperate situation. But then also, we notice that David experienced despair in his spirit in verse 4. Again, he says here, therefore is my spirit overwhelmed within me. My heart within me is desolate. And so once again, as we see over and over in the Psalms and throughout the Bible, that physical troubles can affect us spiritually and emotionally. David was broken, lonely, overwhelmed, desolate. Now this is the man after God's heart. And yet God allowed David to be pushed to the brink where he despaired of life itself. You see, being godly does not exempt us from severe trials. They serve God's purposes so that we may share in his holiness. So we see the trouble that David experienced. Now next we note the attitude that David maintained. Verses 5 and 6. He says, I remember the days of old. I meditate on all thy works. I muse on the work of thy hands. I stretch forth my hands unto thee. My soul thirsteth after thee as a thirsty land. David here, we notice, maintained an attitude of reflection in verse 5. In his commentary on the Psalms, John Phillips writes, instead of moping, David began musing. Instead of worrying over the present with its troubles, he went back to the past with its truths. He thought about the God of yesterday, and behold, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now we know that we are to meditate on the word, but did you also know that we ought to meditate on his works? That's what David is doing here. I remember the days of old, I meditate on all thy works, just pondering God's goodness as demonstrated throughout Scripture, even as demonstrated in our own lives. Has not God proven himself to be faithful to us over and over and over again? Ponder those things. Meditate on the God who is ever faithful. David does, and so should we. So David maintained an attitude of reflection, but also David maintained an attitude of desperation. Verse 6 again, I stretch forth my hand unto thee, my soul thirsteth after thee as a thirsty land. So again, we see David's intensity created by a desperate situation. Now, we don't always feel desperate, but perhaps we should, because in truth, we are. We are always in desperate need for God. And if we can maintain that attitude of desperation, it will make our prayer life more fervent, because it creates in us a heart to cry out to God, to seek his help, to seek his provision, to call him to our aid. So we see the trouble that David experienced. We see the attitude David maintained. And now third, we see the petitions that David proclaimed. And that takes us from verse 7 through the end of the chapter, verse 12. Generally, David's petitions fall into two categories. We note here petitions for deliverance. I'll pick up the reading at verse 7. Hear me speedily, O Lord, my spirit faileth. Hide not thou thy face from me, lest I be like unto them that go down into the pit. Cause me to hear thy loving kindnesses in the morning, for in thee do I trust. Cause me to know the way wherein I should walk, for I lift up my soul unto thee. Deliver me, O Lord, from mine enemies. I flee unto thee to hide me. At the end of verse 11, he says, bring my soul out of trouble. In verse 12, and of thy mercy cut off mine enemies, and destroy all them that afflict my soul, for I am thy servant. So David prays here for deliverance. And we notice here that he sought deliverance, first of all, for his soul. Much of what David seeks here is spiritual in nature. We note that in verses 7 and 8. David desired that God would draw near to him, verse 7. He wants to hear God's loving kindness in the morning, verse 8. He prays for God to revive him in verse 11. And so David was seeking God himself, not just relief from his troubles, but also David sought deliverance from his enemies. Verse 9 again, deliver me, O Lord, from my enemies. And verse 12, cut off my enemies and destroy all them that afflict my soul. So there is nothing wrong in praying for relief from our troubles. But for David, the focus is always first and foremost on God and on his will and glory. And we should remember that. And we should apply that to our own prayer life. In times of trial, our focus is often on relief from the trial. And so that permeates our praying. But we need to remember that God has a purpose in those trials. And it may be his will to keep us in that trial for a period of time so that we may grow in our faith, so that we may grow closer to Him in our walk with Him. And so rather than just focusing on praying for relief, deliverance from our trial, from our adversity, pray for our spiritual conditions, our spiritual needs. Pray that we'll grow closer to the Lord, that we'll walk with Him through that trial. Pray for the deliverance of our souls, that we would come out of that trial more spiritual, closer to God. So David sought deliverance for his soul in his petition for deliverance. He sought deliverance from his enemies. Also, not only does David petition for deliverance, but he petitions for guidance. The end of verse 8, cause me to know the way wherein I should walk, for I lift up my soul unto thee. In verse 10, teach me to do thy will, for thou art my God. Thy spirit is good. Lead me into the land of uprightness. So here is David in a time of severe trial, but he wants to know God's will. He wants to walk in God's will. So he prays that God will guide him, that as God guides him through that trial, he will remain faithful to the will of God. And in so doing, David shows a complete submission to God's will in that time of trial. And he could do that because of his trust in God. As he says in verse 8, for in thee do I trust. And so when we trust God to always do what is right for us and always do what is for our best, we can gladly and freely submit to his sovereign will, even in trials. And so in this psalm, we learn how we should respond in our trials. We learn how we should pray in our trials. But one thing to take away here is that we must always run to God. Go to him, knowing he is our refuge, our strength, a very present help in time of trouble.